It has become a place of pilgrimage for millions and is perhaps our nation's most famous piece of art in the entire world. It also consistently tops #1 on Americans' favorite piece of art in our country. But it is easy to forget that objects like this were made by a person, and they were made in a place, created through very hard physical work and engagement with mental creativity and genius by artists who were all contemporary and groundbreaking in their own era. It is we that actually historicize them. People who lived in places that both inspired them and were transformed by them, and in places where they played out their life narratives, where they enjoyed triumph and suffered loss, and where they were as much people as they were artists. And when I say artists, I mean artists with air quotes and a capital A. If art in museums and gallery spaces or the public monuments we see in our town squares represent the output, these preserved sites represent all the input. And as preserved places that were once the locus of creativity, they are now uniquely poised to inspire visitors today. My own journey, artistic genesis, if you will, began here at Chesterwood in Stockbridge, Mass., the summer home and studio of Daniel Chester French. As Barry has said, it's also where I met Barry first, and I'm equally delighted that our connection and friendship has come full circle in this talk. But I first visited Chesterwood long before I got to meet Barry on a special arts program trip with my family at the age of 10. Yes, I learned about the Lincoln, but I also discovered how French had built this ingenious rail track just beyond the doors of the studio to take works in progress out into the open air to view how changes in light and perspective would alter a piece. I roamed around the artist-designed garden and woodland walks, took in the majesty of the view of Monument Mountain, which inspired French to purchase this piece of property in the first place. I heard about the family life he nurtured here as a respite from the rest of the year he spent at his studio in New York City, and how he called this place and the time spent here heaven. More than a decade later, when I went to apply for my first internship and saw an ad for Chesterwood in the newspaper, all the sensory power of that 10-year-old aged visit came flooding back to me. And I still feel that sensory power today when I am there. And this is where my office is in a non-pandemic time. I still feel this power that I call a genius loci. And I think of it as the guiding spirit and energy of those who originally lived there. But I also think about it as the guiding spirit of those of us who are responsible for that legacy and stewardship today. And this is what every site in this network and in this book has to offer. And I hope we've managed to evoke some of that magic in these pages. But for many of you who may know and have visited this place before, I hope this afternoon will perhaps foster you to look at Chesterwood with new eyes, as you see commonalities between this wonderful place and the other sites that I will highlight. I'd like you to think about Chesterwood as a total work of art, one conceived in the round, much like any one of French's monumental works. That the landscape he designed be considered an extension of his artistic practice, which can give us further insights into his sculptures if we are looking thoughtfully and carefully enough. I like to think of what is offered at all of these sites, including Chesterwood, as not so much an example of art imitating life as an integration of art and life. This book includes artists and places you may be familiar with and those awaiting your discovery. At the top is Andrew Wyeth, a center figure in 3 generations of artists. His local boyhood environment of Chadsford, Pennsylvania, and nearby Crooner Farm fueled him his entire career. He made works in a converted schoolhouse turned studio. And to be there is to understand the work and the complexities of this deeply introspective human being. By contrast, at the bottom is Grace Hudson, who you may have never heard of, a formally educated portrait artist of the indigenous Pomo people, who along with her ethnographer husband, designed an arts and crafts home in Northern California's Mendocino Valley. So let's take a look inside a bit more. This is the sign on Andrew Wyeth's studio. It lets you immediately know the nature of this person and his personality. But it's a good reminder that these were ultimately private spaces and that we are entering here the inner sanctum. It's interesting to see what various artists needed to inspire them, or what environments they needed to surround themselves with in order for them to be productive. And I think this is something we're all thinking about right now, how to work from home, how to be at home perhaps more than we're used to, how to balance life and work and relationships, and how they're all interconnected. Certainly, artists who often work at home understood and understand this. They don't stop being artists just when they close their studio door. So let's take a little journey together. I can't possibly get us to all 48 sites, but I do hope that I will entice you to discover more. Each of these sites and artists warrant entire seminars and monographs of their own, and many have and do. So I'm just going to barely scratch the surface. I'm going to highlight sites throughout the country, but I may bounce back and forth geographically because I want to use these sites to flesh out some larger concepts about artist spaces more generally. So here are two people who many of us think we know. The life and careers of Lee Krasner and Jackson Pollock are epic. Drama on a scale warranting a major Hollywood motion picture starring Ed Harris and Marcia Gay Harden. But they lived together in a small hamlet beyond the center of East Hampton in a small cottage, painting in an outbuilding which overlooked the nearby Saltwater Creek. Here they are in their respective painting modes, both incredibly active processes. And this is their studio, a former fishing shack / barn, which gives us no hint as we look at this slide of the wonders that lie within. And here is the interior of that studio. When you stand on that floor, process is all around you, not just on the floor, but on the walls where Lee Krasner's arcs of painting went beyond the boundaries of the canvases she had tacked there. The experience when you stand there is transformative. And this is a detail of that floor. If I didn't draw attention to the sort of demarcations of the individual floorboards, you might not even guess that this was not a painting by Pollock. I will say to you that you may not know much or frankly care much for abstract expressionism before you go, but you understand it when you stand there. And if you have seen hundreds of Pollock works, as I have, on museum walls and gallery spaces, this makes it all come together for you. This is the embodiment of the physical process and work of art, and you just can't get that anywhere else, because by the time it gets to the museum, the object is standing alone, devoid of that process. Here is someone perhaps lesser known to you, Denver-based artist and teacher Vance Kirkland. He met with early success for his surrealist work, but largely turned away from the commercial aspects of art production. And I want to remind you that art is a product to be sold. It is a commodity, and there are those artists that decide to eschew the aspects of commercial art production. He was a director at the age of 25 of the University of Denver's School of Art, but he left only 3 years later in protest of the fact that the university did not accredit his classes, and that gives you a sense of who he is. Undeterred, though, he soon started the Kirkland School of Art the following year, which is now preserved as a public site. On the right is an example of his dot painting work, Explosions on a Sun 100 Billion Light Years from Earth. He had synesthesia, a condition in which there is sensory overlap. And in this case, Kirkland saw colors when he listened to music. He actually could not do both at the same time. It was just too much stimulus. So he would listen to music and then go into the studio and paint what he heard. And this is the interior on the left of that studio workroom. Those are straps suspended from the ceiling where he would hang over that table on his belly, sort of caressed by those straps as he worked overhead on large scale works on that table. Many artists create these types of aids to assist in process, and we can only learn about them when we visit their studios, just like the railroad tracks at Chesterwood. Here, you see the work at right I showed you earlier in the context of those objects Kirkland collected and was drawn to aesthetically. And that gives you, I think, even further insight into the impulses and sort of aesthetic choices of this artist. Here is someone I think, again, many of us have at least heard of, Homer. And that is him standing in front of one of his marine works, painted in his home and studio in Prouts Neck, Maine. The photo of him reinforces the image we have of him as this grizzled recluse of a man holed up in rugged Maine, an image that he helped perpetuate, by the way. By the time he moves to Maine full-time, he has already become a well-known illustrator for Harper's Weekly, a documentarian of the Civil War, and a successful genre painter of pastoral and rural life. He lives and works out of a converted carriage barn, which is part of a bigger complex of buildings owned by his family. I want to draw your attention to the fact that there are relatively small and minimal windows when you think about an artist studio and the sort of prototypical large windows of that type of space. So it's less than what you would expect, but I want you to look at that balcony. This is the view from that balcony. Homer's brother used to say he would wear out the floorboards from pacing on it. This was a view Homer came to know intimately and daily. The cliff walk is just a short way down from the studio. Either before or after your visit, you can see this painting at lower right, weather beaten, on view at the Portland Museum of Art, which owns this site. This view makes you understand Homer, what moved him as a man as well as an artist. And you stand in the painting when you are there. You hear the pounding of the surf, you feel the spray of that water, and you taste the salt on your tongue. And this is the insight that one can get into the mental process of art and the making of art through inspiration. This is another big icon. This is the high school graduation picture of Edward Hopper, and that is a young man on the verge of something great. So right before he becomes something entirely singular. It's an artist who has earned the rarefied accolade of a word in our English dictionary, Hopperesque. He grew up in Nyack in the lower Hudson Valley, just north of New York City. And at right is a painting called 7 a.m. Nyack, New York, currently in the collection of the Whitney Museum. And this was painted long after he left his childhood home, so decades later, not painted on location, but stayed in memory. And today you can actually do a walking tour linking painted sites to specific views and places in town. Rarely do we get to visit a site of artistic genesis, but this is one. Like so many artists, before you get your dream studio, and that assumes that you will ever get your dream studio, your first studio is in a room of your house. And this was Hopper's boyhood bedroom. Hopper once said there was a sort of elation about sunlight on the upper part of a house. The signature light that marks his entire career can be seen here, streaming through the windows of his childhood home. And I use this slide because inspiration is not always linear and it's not always episodic in that he spent his childhood home here, but this sort of maturation of this idea of breaking light across spaces in his paintings happens later and throughout the rest of his career. I'd like to introduce you to another figurative sculptor, although one very different from Daniel Chester French. And that's what's so great about Haas and this book. It allows for these juxtapositions. Many artists lived and worked in urban environments. This is the Greenwich Village home and studio of Chaim Gross, arts educator and direct carver. He immigrated to New York at 20 to escape the increasing anti-Semitic wave. He is a self-proclaimed American dream story. And this type of narrative is what so many of these sites has to offer. Universal stories of perseverance and triumph and loss. And these help to break down the barriers that we create and the pedestals that we put these artists on as sort of these genius artists. Here he is seated in the studio that he helped design. And here is a view of that studio today. And you can see how intact it is to the slide before. We could honestly just drop him right back in here and no one would ever know the difference. I've talked a lot about inspiration, but these sites are at their essence about the physicality of making. All the tools of the trade are here. The chisels, the sketches, the pencils. You can start to make connections between the process and the finished works. And this happens time and again at these sites, because at their core, these places are where art was made. You have, as scholar Wanda Korn, who wrote the book's foreword, asserts, returned to the scene of the crime. But these sites allow us to venture beyond that studio space. This room shows but one example of what I consider to be the consistent curatorial impulses of these artists. Here, Gross's own work is arranged among his collections of African masks, which were highly influential to his work. But they are among works by colleagues such as Red Grooms and Raphael Sawyer, as well as those of European masters such as Renoir, along the trappings of everyday and mundane life. And you see at the bottom of all that art, a record player. This composing is an extension of what they do in the studio. Right now, I think we are keenly attuned to the decisions that we make in our own homes. Artists are fearless and they give us permission to emulate them. As you've already seen, there is home decor inspiration within these pages and at these sites. And I think it helps to illustrate the concept that what color you paint your bedroom says something about who you are and what moves you. And that's true for artists as well. Here is a couple you may not know, George L.K. Morris and Susie Frelinghuysen. And this is a modernist counterpoint to the retreat created by Daniel Chester French at Chesterwood. The site is just down the road from Chesterwood in nearby Lenox, Massachusetts. And I had the privilege of working here for 5 years prior to this site being open to the public. This is an artist couple who were deeply involved in the American abstract artist movement and who also had homes in New York and Paris. They created a rural retreat designed in concert with a local architect. So many artists design their own spaces, either on their own or in collaboration. Here, this is a stucco building and glass brick and a fresco designed by Morris in the breezeway. To say that it is experimental would be an understatement relative to this climate. And so often these artists' homes stretch boundaries of expressions and design, but also frankly of practicality. This is one of the first modern structures in the state, built within the same period as Marcel Breuer's Gropius House in Lincoln, Massachusetts. The studio, which is at far left and slightly on the hill rise, is earlier still, based on Amédée aux Enfants studio in Paris by Le Corbusier, which George Morris saw when he was studying in France with Cubist painter Fernand Léger. This is a really interesting couple. He was an art critic and she was an opera singer, in addition to them both being artists. It's so indicative of the complex lives of these artists that are in the network, and I seek to make these biographical details come alive in this book. Here is the living room, replete with Argentinian leather floor, Art Deco furnishings, and Susan's stunning piano at the far back. Beyond the large windows, you see a lush landscape, orchards, pool house, and pond await. This was a glamorous couple, and this house reflects that. But I want to draw your attention to the murals and bas-relief by Morris at Wright. Morris was a sculptor as well as a painter. There are frescoes, reliefs, and murals by George and Susie throughout the house. These are works of art that can only be seen here in the places for which they are designed. And many sites in the network include these exclusive artistic elements. For each site in the book, I sought to include a fun fact. And in this instance, when design costs ran over, something some of us may be familiar with, we've all done improvement projects, Morris sold Pablo Picasso's The Poet, which he owned, to Peggy Guggenheim to cover his overage building and design costs. Once part of the Guggenheim personal collection, this extremely famous painting now hangs in the museum in New York. Here is Frelinghuysen's murals in the dining room. This is a totally different style and palette than her husband, and she has inserted corrugated metal into the fresco surface to create a sculptural element. And I just want to be really clear, this is true fresco in true Italian tradition. They learned how to create these, and even though they look nothing like perhaps the other types of frescoes that you may have seen in Europe. And here we enter Morris's studio. Yes, that's an inlaid marble checkerboard floor in a workspace. So I just want you to think about that, dripping with paint. And this is a workspace. But what we also see on display here is a selection from the rich Cubist collection amassed by this couple, including works by Pablo Picasso, Juan Gris, and Georges Braque. Hanging from the ceiling is an Alexander Calder mobile. Many of these artist sites contain collections of works by friends, colleagues, or artists admired from previous generations, as well as course, their own works. I'd like to take us to a completely different type of house and artist. This is Font Hill, created by scholar, collector, archaeologist, and tile maker Henry Chapman Mercer in Doylestown, Pennsylvania. And Haas includes these types of visual artists as well, people like furniture makers and ceramicists. He built his dream home entirely out of concrete, using a method he invented. So many of these homes became laboratories for experimentation, like the frescoes we just saw at the Frelinghuysen Morris site. Here, in their personal spaces, artists are free to stretch their creativity. In the design of personal spaces, there is no patron to please, so ideas and expression can be more free. Here, although incredibly earnest about his practice, Mercer knew he could joke about himself, especially when people questioned him about this crazy endeavor of building a concrete castle, which newspapers did almost daily, even as he was erecting it. This ease with himself is reflected in this photo with his beloved dog Rolo, whose paw prints he immortalized in one of the myriad concrete stairs inside this house. What awaits us inside is unexpected. The inside highlights Mercer's love of tile. I like to call it tile mania. There are Persian, Dutch, Chinese tiles, even ancient Babylonian texts in this house. Here in the saloon, which is what he called it, massive windows cast light on a dense arrangement of tile, which have been inset into every conceivable surface, including the ceiling. They include Moravian tiles of Mercer's own design, and the Tile Works factory he started nearby is still in production today, and you can go visit that. The completed house is part home and part museum for the artist's eclectic ceramic, engraving, and book collections. It does have castle-like proportions. It boasts 44 rooms and 18 fireplaces. And while the house is loaded with historical references and objects, Mercer also included all the modern conveniences of his own era, including an elevator, intercom systems, and running bathrooms. I wanted to show a modernist counterpoint to the idea of what I call a handmade home. Russell Wright was an industrial designer of furniture and tableware, like these modern American pictures you see at right. Many of you may be familiar with them. He co-authored a book entitled Guide to Easier Living, in which he and his co-author wife laid out their aesthetic tenets adapted to the suburban household. And this book has been reprinted and is available online if you want to further explore those tenets. Here is the exterior of the house he designed. This is called Dragon Rock as part of the larger campus Manitoga. He built this completely out of an abandoned former stone quarry site. And you can see that the house is just nestled in like a jewel into the cliff face. Just beyond the picture frame, that ledge falls starkly away to a deep pool and a series of small waterfalls. You see here green roofs, clearly a modernist aesthetic, but also Japanese influences. And if you look very hard, you can see a table in the interior. And here is a view of that table out left from inside the house. He used the natural stone cropping to create natural levels within the house, and you see elements of the stone outcropping throughout the house. The tree provides structure and a natural element, and Wright changed the decor with the seasons and experimented with lighting, as he had started as a theater set designer. This industrialist designer had a deep interest in nature, and he experimented with all kinds of natural materials. In the bathroom at Wright, you see a butterfly screen made entirely of natural specimens and a branch that serves as a towel rack. Elsewhere, there are stone doorknobs and birch bark wrapped doorways and hemlock needles impressed into wall surfaces. This is an interesting counterpoint to the industrialist nature of Wright's commercial practice. Wright also designed the landscape, and in this case, as a series of outdoor rooms, which you can still visit today. There are also more traditional artists who move away from visual arts into multidisciplinary exploration, expression, and experimentation, where a painter can become an architect, landscape architect, and an interior designer. Such as Olana, the home of Hudson River School painter Frederick Edwin Church. As Barry mentioned, I had the pleasure of working here on curatorial staff for 17 years before departing to actually come to Historic Artists' Homes and Studios. Olana is a 250-acre work of art as an expression of Church's greater sensibilities, and it's all crowned by a Persian fantasy home of his design at the summit of the hill. Church was a world explorer. Here he is at Wright in Beirut in 1868 with his young son. And this is part of his image building as an explorer, capturing the far reaches of the globe in his artworks. Inside and Out is an amalgam of experiences had on world travels and those things of his own imagination, ideas reinvented through his artistic prism. There are stencils in the court hall that take inspiration from tiled buildings he saw while traveling in the Middle East. In the far, far back of this image is a window made completely of cut paper, pressure fit between two pieces of amber glass, emulating the ambient light and screens he would have seen in the Middle East. And everywhere are objects. I always like to say, Church was a curator's artist because he loved objects as much as any curator. This is seen often as a Persian house, but I would argue is far more complex. So let's look at a detail. This is one corner of one bookcase in the same room we were just in. And on this shelf is, and in this sort of vignette, is a butterfly brought back from Colombia, a hollowware series of objects from Tehran, folk Mexican pottery, and 19th century Chinese blue ceramic, draped by shells from Madagascar, given to him by another artist, Marianne North. And I always like to say, if there's another layer to be added, the ceramic blue souffle vase is not enough. You need Madagascar shells on top of it to make it complete. These are not necessarily connoisseur objects. They are associative. trophies of travel of a sort, certainly, but the key is in the arranging. It's like composing a painting. This is the type of work that brought him fame and fortune. And this is the view from the other side of that same room. This is the landscape beyond, which Church took 40 years perfecting, more than any singular painting. Here, as other artists are in their homes, he had no client, he had no commission, and therefore was unfettered and could completely explore. For me, Church is a master of color, of theatricality, and harmonizing details within a greater sweeping panoramic composition. That's what I see in every single one of his paintings. And all of that is here at Alana, writ large in new ways for us to discover. And this happens at so many sites. I'd like to move now south. This is Ann Norton, whose home and studio is in West Palm Beach, Florida, and is one of the newer sites in our network. Here she is, hard at work at the piece Seven Figures, inspired by a cliff face in Utah. Inspiration can literally come from anywhere, and which can be seen on site today. So that figurative piece you see at right was inspired by a cliff face that she saw in Utah. And of course, the various aspects of sculpture making are displayed in the studio she designed, such as rough logs awaiting further carving, armatures for modeling clay, plaster models of the same work we actually just saw in the previous slide. But the studio spaces also allow for us to take in the less glamorous aspects of art making, such as that very large slop sink. Here are details that might be missed when visiting in person. These are the complex patina potions and formulas that create surfaces on bronze sculpture, a bit of the alchemy that evokes the same childlike wonder we all had when first modeling clay, or let's say finger painting. But this is what awaits outside the studio. Again, a multidisciplinary expression of art, architecture, and landscape. These are monumental brickworks, late in career, each brick hand-formed and home-fired, completely integrated into a landscape of Norton's design. As Norton faced terminal leukemia, she embarked on creating a lush tropical oasis in her suburban town, with the goal to leave it for her community to enjoy in perpetuity. And I love this story because it's so personal to her. And it speaks to the human desires to create, to connect, but also to endure and to have legacy. This is also a preservation story. All of these sites were saved through effort, at times like this one by the artist, and at others by those with a fierce commitment to ensuring legacy. And this is an important aspect of these sites that we also sought to include in the book. But not everyone decides to build their dream home or studio from scratch. Some demonstrate their ingenious application of what we call in the preservation field, adaptive reuse, which means taking an existing structure and transforming it to meet your individual vision and needs. Georgia O'Keeffe, known as the mother of modernism, her home and studio in Abiquiu, New Mexico is perhaps one of the more famous. The infamous black door in the inner courtyard of her adobe home was the subject of more than 20 paintings. The desert landscape that inspired her has become synonymous with this artist and her work. She had to wait years until the Catholic Church would sell her this site, and then she painstakingly made it her own through preservation of the traditional adobe, but also by adding modern touches, such as the large 1950s picture window you see. And that was, of course, to optimize her views. Here is the interior of her sitting room, looking out at cottonwood trees, also a favored painting subject. The aesthete spare quality is representative of her modern sensibilities and is punctuated with very few objects, like this Bertoia bird chair at the left, which almost serves like a sculpture in the room. And so all of this that you see on this slide is probably very expected and familiar, what you would think Georgia O'Keeffe's home would look like. But you might be surprised, as the book reveals, that the most crowded room in the house is the kitchen and the pantry. The artist was a foodie and an ardent believer in food sustainability. She grew her own staples on site and made her own yogurt, and her gardens have recently been restored and can be enjoyed by visitors. As a comparison is Grant Wood's space in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. This is the painter of one of the most appropriated images in all of the visual artistic lexicon, American Gothic. It's appeared on everything. I've seen lunchboxes to beach towels. This image shows the persona that Wood sought to create: white shirt, black wingtip shoes, and overalls, referencing him both to farm and factory workers of the region. And this is part personal branding and persona making. Wood was actually incredibly cosmopolitan and had studied in Europe. Although part of the image making was something he perpetuated not only through his clothing, but his quotes. All the really good ideas I ever had came to me while I was milking a cow. Well, perhaps, or perhaps it might have been some really formal instruction that he had in Paris. Who's to say? Each chapter in the book begins with artist quotes like this, and that gives us a bit of entree into the personality, and in this case, the sharp wit of this artist. He worked in a converted garage given to him by his patrons. This is a masterwork of DIY and loft living. There is literally no space wasted here. He actually lived in this small space with other family, and he did ingenious things like making a bathtub out of an old hay chute space. And it makes us remember that Grant Wood actually started as a decorative arts artist. You see a bushel basket here is reused as a stove mantle, and the metalwork of his own design is on the radiator screen at far left, as well as the lighting fixtures that you see. This small space is a reminder that many artists struggle financially in their own era and during their own lives, and that masterworks we all now know on museum walls were created in these types of humble spaces. This is another aspect of his wry sense of humor, the front door. It's made from a coffin lid because the funeral home was right next door. He painted on a glass clock, which denotes things such as taking a bath and having a party. The satire of his paintings finds expression in his home, and we understand this to be an intrinsic part of who he is, not just what he paints. And these connections, the magic of artistic inspiration, is found at sites like these. Here is adaptive reuse on grand scale. Sculptor, arts writer, and furniture designer Donald Judd turned an abandoned 19th century cast iron sewing factory in New York's Soho neighborhood into a place where he could experiment with his ideas about the permanent installation of art. Once complete, it was also a place for gathering to discuss ideas about art, an informal salon of sorts, which happened at many sites, and he painstakingly restored this floor by floor. Here is an example of how Judd's ideas manifested, combining living and workspace with furniture of his own design and works by contemporaries. On the wall at left is a work by Frank Stella, originally owned by the architect Philip Johnson, but traded for the work by Judd that now graces the grounds at Johnson's Glass House in Connecticut, also open as a public site now in New Canaan. Several years later, Judd expanded upon his ideas in Marfa, Texas, a site also in the Haas network. His projects at Marfa were executed with a clear vision towards his own artistic legacy and were even larger in scope than in New York City. Conceptual artist David Ireland adapted his own space from a Victorian home in San Francisco's Mission District. This was the former home and sales room of an accordion salesman. And if you look closely, you can see the gilded lettering sign with the name of the accordion salesman in the window. Here, David Ireland is creating a sculpture by tossing concrete between his hands until it becomes a perfect sphere. And that gives you a little bit of a sense of what we're dealing with and what is to come inside. This is the ultimate in DIY. He did a series of what he deemed maintenance actions, returning architecture to its very bones. And you can see the exposed window casements at right. This was part homeowners restoration and part performance art, as he would tape himself doing these what he called interventions. He recorded the cracks and history of the plaster walls through numerous coats of polyurethane, which is why the surfaces look like that. When you're in there today, it glows like amber, and it's like being in an encased jewel box. He used everyday objects to transform them into works of art. That's a chandelier made out of a set of propane torches on the ceiling. And on the mantle is a sculpture made of jarred dirt collected while cleaning. This site breaks conventional ideas of studio and home altogether. The whole thing is one large art installation. This is also a newer site, just saved and preserved within the last few years. And I want to convey that these types of sites are not static, more are coming online all the time. And helping to guide those artists, descendants, or preservationists through that process is part of the work we do. Ireland may seem a bit out there for some of us, but he is an icon of conceptual art. So I want to briefly touch upon the types of artists who are underrepresented or do not traditionally fit into the mainframe of art history at all. And we are seeking to bring more artists like this into the network. Self-taught artists, folk artists, indigenous artists, and people of color. Clementine Hunter worked her whole life as a field laborer and later as a domestic staff at a plantation in Louisiana. She did not even begin to create art until midlife, and when she had already become a grandmother, using discarded materials from a visiting artist to the plantation. And she is an example that it is never too late to start being creative. She painted on everything: cardboard, mugs, cigar boxes, and she thinned her paint to make it last longer. This is one of the buildings on the plantation where she worked, designed, built, and used by slaves in an earlier generation than Clem, who was born emancipated. But here is what she created in the space's upper floor: a series of murals on plywood depicting her life on the plantation, including cotton picking washing day, and here at left, going to church. I like to think of this as a bit of reappropriation by her and on her terms. But this is in part because she was never able to build her own signature home and studio. We used to call this type of work outsider art, but now we refer to it often as insider, because only she can tell this incredibly personal story through artistic means. Her narrative is inspiring, but it also reminds us of the work to be done in validating these contributions to our artistic legacy through preserved spaces. We're excited that in just the past week, we introduced 4 new sites to Haas, all centered around strong women's narratives. We're actively seeking to bring these narratives forward. I've taken us all around the country, but I'd like to finish back in dear old Connecticut, which boasts its own strong tradition of artistic history. The state boasts 3 of the most important preserved artist enclaves in the nation. One is Bush Holly House, an 18th century home turned 19th century boarding house in Cos Cob, which was the gathering place for the first American Impressionist colony in this country. Here's John Tuckman teaching a student near the waterfront. Artists drew inspiration from the historic village and nearby farms, and it was a short rail trip to escape from New York City. The boarding house drew artists for decades and was initially run by a couple, the Hollies, whose daughter Constance then took over the establishment. She married artist Elmer McRae, one of the visiting artists that you see at upper left, and that's his easel and a painting of her on it. You can see from these images how intact these interiors are, and the home contains works by many of the artists who stayed and painted there. This site, though, is more than just the house and includes a repurposed hotel, tavern, and storefront, which were all vital to the colony and now serve as an exhibition, an interpretive space, and a cafe. So if you visited here before, you should go again, because this was all just unveiled in 2019. These places are always evolving through restoration or programming. Many of these same artists were associated with another property. We traveled to the farm Julian Alden Weir bought when he was already an established portrait painter in New York. Weir purchased the farm by parting with a European painting in his own collection, much coveted by the property owner. And in addition to the trade of the painting, he had to pay an additional $10 to secure the property. Once there, he created a close-knit family home and convivial atmosphere for other artists, turning to his immediate environs for new inspiration, as evidenced in the work Autumn that you see on right in the site's collection. And what I just want to make clear is this was a person who was known for figurative work, moved to rural Connecticut, and then completely basically changed his mode of painting. It's like stepping into a Robert Frost poem. Everything is here, stone walls, red barns, and paths that wind through pasture and woodland. And one of the numerous outbuildings is Weir's studio, a ceiling he painted blue-green to emulate the sky. This is a frequent treatment, actually, of artists, and accented with plaster painted stars. But here was the artist's true studio, nature. Other artists painted these environs, including John Henry Twachtman, who you saw at Bush Holly, Albert Pinkham Ryder, and Childe Hassam, who all made extended stays to this property. His daughter, Dorothy, an artist in her own right, married sculptor Mahan Rai Young, who is best known for This Is the Place monument in Salt Lake City, Utah. He built his own two-story studio on property, which you see here. He was befriended by artist couple Doris and Sperry Andrews, who later took up residence and helped to ensure, along with Dorothy, the property's preservation. So there's 3 generations of artists here. And this is today a national parks site and newly immortalized on a special edition United States quarter. But this is, in fact, the most influential of all, the Old Lyme Art Colony. More than 150 artists came to paint here. Many stayed in a boarding house run by unmarried entrepreneur Florence Griswold. That's Childe Hassam, who was also at Coscob and Ware Farm, painting the apple blossoms en plein air. And that is the painting on that easel pictured at right, which was only recently rediscovered a few years ago at auction and is now in the site's collection and on view. Below is the view from fellow artist William Chadwick's studio, which gives you a glimpse of the bucolic landscape, which butts up against the Lieutenant River. But this was as much about community as it was about painting. This, at left, is the self-named Hot Air Club on the back porch. The name speaks for itself. Gentlemen who were known for pontificating about art, about politics, about what have you. And at right is the view today from the entry hall towards that same porch, which Griswold turned into a painting sales gallery. And just beyond the porch, you get a little bit of a glimpse of the extensive gardens that she designed, which inspired works of art, but also provided food for the table. I like to think about all those conversations and laughter. And even though it's, more than a century later, one still gets a sense of what it must have been like to be there when you visit today. But the site's showpiece is the formal dining room, for which it was an honor to be selected to paint a panel. There was even a committee who decided which colleagues were worthy. Like the frescoes at the Frelinghuysen Morris property, these works of art were made for this space and can only ever be experienced by visiting here. They also, though, illustrate the ideas of artistic collaboration and fierce competition among friends and rivals. And those relationships are what one gets to learn about when visiting these types of sites. And at left is Miss Florence, as she was called. And what we can clearly see is still a completely intact, one-of-a-kind art environment installation. I'll finish here with a slide of St. Gaudens National Historic Site in Cornish, New Hampshire, home to Daniel Chester French's friend and colleague, sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens, who created another vibrant artist colony in rural New England. These artistic connections are some of the fun things one gets to discover when reading the book, or better still, I would argue, visiting the site. I hope this lecture will start you on your own journey, and that the book will offer rich virtual travel until such time as you may feel you can venture out again. Many sites remain closed for the immediate future, but many also have opened their landscapes throughout the pandemic for respite and renewal, such as the Augustus St. Gaudens sites. And I'd urge you to please consult with individual sites to see about opportunities for visitation. Many plan to open this spring and summer season. The book is available at all major retailers and through the publisher, Princeton Architectural Press, and exclusive signed copies are in very limited edition, are available through Barry, and also at chesterwood.org. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Valerie. Okay, so if anybody has questions, please send them through the chat room. I'm sure Valerie would be happy to answer them. What's happened to my chat box here?
So thank you for indulging me. I'm usually quite timely.
Yeah,
I went off script a little bit, which meant I went over time a little bit.
Yeah.
But thank you all for staying with us.
Bill Hosley says, awesome. Thank you, Bill. Excellent. Yes, we're getting lots of accolades in here. So it really is the perfect armchair travel. I feel like I've just zoomed across the country and seen.
And I would urge you, although I've had the pleasure to work at many artists' homes, basically my entire career, and visited many before I took the job I currently hold. But certainly this position has afforded me the opportunity to travel to places that perhaps were not on my top 10 list, or places that I didn't think I would go to. And I would urge you, because it has been very much my own journey. You know, I have art that I like and art that perhaps is not completely in my wheelhouse, that you really should think broader than perhaps the art you already know and love. And, you know, I am not a Western girl, and Western painting is not perhaps what I would choose to put on my walls. But traveling over in a very, very small plane to Great Falls, Montana, and being immersed in that culture and being immersed in those studio spaces of Charlie Russell really completely transformed my own understanding of what it meant to be a Western painter and what it means to be a Western painter today. Yeah. And I just would urge you, you may not think conceptual house, David Ireland's polyurethane coated walls are your thing, but in San Francisco, I would still urge you to go. You might surprise yourself. It's really fascinating to step into the mind of an artist, one you may not even think you understand. And it really does change your view, which is what I think art is all about.
Right. We do have a question. Is from Michael Selleck. Is there any effort to establish more contemporary artist homes and studios as places of interest?
Yes.
Good. Because for
so
example,
that is, and I can say that what happens is that is a part of the process. So I am in conversation right now with a number of more, people who have passed away, but in recent years, with their descendants, where they are preparing currently to open places within the next 3 to 5 years. I can't talk about them so much because they're not public yet. And the work goes on in terms of really talking to living artists today to think about place in terms of legacy, because often artists think more about the work and wanting to make sure that the work is placed where they would want it to be placed, to make sure that they become immortal, for lack of a better word. And they often like to establish foundations and opportunities to pay forward to emerging artists, which is really beautiful and wonderful. They don't tend to think about the place where they lived and worked. It's just where they did their thing. So it is often a process of making them think in terms of the fact that 10, 20 years from now, people will want to come and visit and learn about them in this way. So it's a big part of the work. And my hope is in the next, I want to say 4 or 5 sites that represent more contemporary artists that should be coming online. And shortly after them coming online, we hope to bring them into the network. And so I urge you to stay tuned.
Yes, good. We have another question from our good friend Bill Hosley, who says, do you go to open studio events? And what's your favorite?
Oh, do I go to like living artist
Like
open
contemporary?
studio events?
Yes, yeah.
I do. It's kind of like, I mean, I hate to say, and it's kind of like when you're a curator. You know, people ask you so often what your favorite object is, and it really depends on the day. And any given day, I don't want, I picked another, you know, another thing that I would save in the fire with my own body. So it really depends. And I hate to say, you know, I will be honest that I don't get to go to as many as I would like to or used to, because so much of my work now is about making sure that these other places are saved. So I'm constantly discovering artists that I never knew anything about, who are saving their spaces. And so, but I think that this, I think what I'm doing more often is happening a lot at these historic spaces, which is not really your question, but I'd like the audience to think about it, is part of the way that these historic spaces stay relevant and connected today is that they actively work with contemporary living artists who are commissioned to do work, are created to do work, inspired not just necessarily in the mode in a linear way where a person who is inspired by Pollock and paints by Pollock is invited to come, but Pollock's a good example. There's someone doing an opera about Pollock, a really Brian Pruchark, and that's an artist that's going to be launched this year. And so you have people who do spoken word who are invited to these sites. And so I think this sort of bridge with the past to the contemporary moment is something also that these sites, much more than they would have done even 10 years ago. So my open studios tend to be, you know, Kiki Smith's envisioning and interaction and intervention at a place like the Thomas Cole National Historic Site in Catskill. That's where my interface tends to happen now. But I would urge people to, it's really important to go into living and working spaces today when you can, because unlike when you go to Alana and you have to listen to me say what my opinion is about what you're seeing, the living artists can tell you exactly what's going on, and there's really nothing quite like that.
Yes, true. True.
So I evaded it. I never say who my favorite children are, dead or living.
Okay, fair enough, fair enough. Someone's asked if the program was recorded. Yes, it was. I'm afraid I sort of realized I hadn't pushed the button for the first few minutes, so you will get not the entire program, I'm sorry to say, but most of it. So lots of thank yous. Brian says, thank you for kickstarting the warmer weather post-COVID touring. So good, inspiring us all to get out there and
and I
travel.
would say, I mean what I say, which is that you know, sometimes these homes, that they were meant to be private homes, right? So Alana is an example of a very large home, but many of these places are much smaller and humble. And so the ability to bring people through safely can be challenging, and it certainly may remain challenging. But so many of these artists were inspired to do their own gardens and landscapes. And so if either the site or you don't quite feel like you're ready to engage yet, you know, inside in a group setting, I would definitely urge you to set off and see some of these views and landscapes and environs that inspired so many of these artists. Sometimes these are, you know, 200 plus acres of land that are now available for you to walk around and understand how it inspired the artist, but also how it created renewal and sort of re-engagement by that artist. And you feel that when you're there. So I would urge you to look at both and to go somewhere maybe you never thought you would go.
Yes,
I went to Boise, Idaho. Again, perhaps not a place I thought I would go. And that is the home of a self-taught deaf artist, and is probably one of the most sublime and transformative visits I've made in my entire career.
Interesting.
And
Yeah. I love that you're seeking out some of these other, and the new term insider art. I think that's is a great, a much better terminology for some of this great art that's out there that people have created. Okay, well, I don't see any more questions coming in, just lots of thank yous and people looking forward to reading the book. And again, and should organize tours for any of the nearby sites. Well, we can work on that. I know the library has been doing well, probably not in the past year, but that we're hosting events too. They went to Alana and Chesterwood and places like that. But yes, it's certainly something we can work on using Valerie's fabulous book as our guide.
And I would also say, and I told Barry I would say this, sometimes it's hard on Zoom. You think of a question later. Part of my job is being there for people who are interested and enthusiastic, whether it's during the Zoom lecture or after. So, we have a website, and on there is contact information. And if you have a question, even a week, 2 weeks, whatever it is from now, please feel free to reach out and I will happily answer it. And of course, if you want to continue to learn about sites that we bring online, that the book is already old because we brought 4 new sites on just a couple weeks ago, publicly announced, honestly, just last week. You can sign up for our newsletter or follow us on Facebook, etc. But I really do mean that you can reach out to me personally if you have a question or you didn't think something was clear, or you just want to reach out. And of course, if there's a site you think I should think about, you should also reach out. Don't assume I know about it. I like to think I know a lot, but there's always things that come to my attention, and it often comes via people like you.
Yeah,
so
great.
Thank you so much. And it's always a pleasure to be with Barry. It gives us an excuse
to
yes, do
likewise,
live planning and chatting. And
do you have, can you, I don't know how one would do this, but do you have the website? Can you put it, can you post
I can
it?
see if I can put it in the chat.
Yeah, there you go. And I can try and I can put it up on our website or something.
And I will put the disclaimer in that the website is not looking amazing right now because it's several years old, but we just got a lovely grant from the Henry Luce Foundation to redo it completely. So it's sort of my disclaimer. I still want you to go on it, but know that it will be all new and upgraded in the coming years. So I've put my personal email as well as the website in there.
Perfect. Great. Well, Valerie, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to spend the afternoon with us, and thank you for producing such a fabulous book. It's been a pleasure to look through it, and the photography and the layout is really great. So I encourage everybody to get a copy of this book. We've donated a copy to the library, so there's one that's available at the library for I assume it's in circulation, and you can also, the library has a little stash of these books which we are selling. So if you can't get a hold of me, you can go right to the Norfolk Library when they're open and purchase one of these books. So thank you.
Thank you, Barry, for always being such a lovely host and such a lovely friend.
You're most welcome.
Thank you to all of you, and have a lovely rest of your weekend. And thank you for taking time this afternoon. Much appreciated.
We will be in touch.
Thank you.
Okay,
have
thank you,
evening,
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.